Boy, the left is obsessed with race to the point that has really hurt the country in so many ways over time. And they say that, your race determines your destiny. And therefore, all of society should be structured around either advantaging you or holding you back on the basis of your skin color. It's absurd, but unfortunately, it's predominant. Here to discuss the latest manifestations of that is Joe Simonson, a senior investigative reporter for the Washington Free Beacon. He joins us on the phone. Joe, good to have you with us, sir. Thank you.
Vince, how are we?
Doing so well, Joe, and concerned, though, about your reporting this week. You have a headline, How the Biden Administration Put Race at the Center of Government Spending. How are they spending my money?
Yeah, no, it is disturbing. And Vince, every time I'm on your show, I feel like I just upset you with my news reporting. But this one, unfortunately, is not much better than other things I've come on to talk about. So to make a long story short, Biden, in his first month or two in office, signed this executive order, which established something called the Justice 40 Initiative. And what that does is it mandates that 40% or more of all climate spending going forward has to go to what the federal government defines as a disadvantaged community. Now, there are two things that are important to know about that. One is that everything, all the new spending that Biden has signed into law is climate spending. That includes the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act. I bet a lot of Republicans didn't know that when they voted for it. And I bet a lot of people don't know that today. But bridges, all that kind of stuff, new roads, that is actually technically climate spending according to the federal government now. So that means if you want a new bridge, or if there are grants grants available for money to build a new bridge, the political appointees at places such as the Department of Transportation are looking to give them to what they call disadvantaged communities. Now, what is a disadvantaged community? Well, a disadvantaged community does not just mean you're poor, right? So if you're a poor coal mining town or whatever, or you're just a lower working class area, you're not necessarily a disadvantaged community. You have to meet several criteria, one of which is low income, but you have to meet more than just being low income. And what the White House has done is say, well, we've created all these proxies for race. So things that they believe disproportionately impact minorities. And another way that they're basically just making sure that a lot of this money just goes to minority communities is that they've given hundreds of millions of dollars in funding through the IRA to what they call community-based groups. And I think a lot of people know what community-based groups is code for. That is local activist groups in cities and towns across the country, obviously overwhelmingly left-wing, if not exclusively left-wing. And so those left-wing groups are there to provide technical assistance. And what technical assistance means is that they're helping people get the money. And a lot of these groups that are providing technical assistance, as I reported, on their websites openly say, if you're applying for a grant, make sure you're a person of color, make sure you're a black person, make sure you're a black woman, etc.
So the federal government is using racial prejudice as a means to disperse taxpayer funding?
Correct, yes. And it's funny, it's today, so one of the examples I cite in my piece was about, I talked to a career official of the Department of Transportation who's going through all these EV grants, and they, a place such as Alexandria, a lot of electric vehicles in Alexandria near me in DC, they don't have a large enough disadvantaged community population, so they're not getting necessarily those EV grants. And today, the White House, or the Department of Transportation actually, just came out with the results of their first round of grant funding. And guess what? They're bragging that 70% of all the new EV charging grants went to disadvantaged communities. And I looked into, well, who got that money? Well, one of them, Vince, is a rural town in Alaska with a large native population that has 1,500 people in it. They got, I think, $3 million for an electric vehicle charging station in rural Alaska.
How effective, I mean, you may be getting to this point, but how effective is an electric vehicle in rural Alaska?
You know, I'm not going to say there are no electric vehicles up in this town. I've not been there.
Right.
But I can't imagine there are many.
I'm going to tell you right now. If I lived in Alaska, I would rely on an internal combustion engine. I would not be. I would not be playing around with an electric vehicle. Not exactly the climate for that.
No, exactly. And other they gave, I think, $10 million for Baltimore and HBCUs in the area. Now, I don't, maybe I'm not saying that HBCUs shouldn't get that money, but it doesn't seem like there's any evidence that, overwhelmingly black parts of Baltimore have a huge demand for electric vehicle chargers.
Well, it kind of also depends on whether or not you have space in your house to keep an electric vehicle, doesn't it? I mean, this is I get charging stations outside of your home, but if you basically the infrastructure required at home is another thing. You got to have probably garage space, a reliable access to a plug outlet that can sit next to your vehicle. I mean, there are some bare minimum requirements here.
Yeah, and sure, and that speaks to the point is that this isn't really based off demand, right? I mean, this place in Alaska that's getting this money, these areas of Baltimore. I mean, I'm happy to be proven wrong here, but when I think of who drives EVs, I think of Blue Alexandria, right? And
right. Well, it's impractical in a city. I mean, if you live in a high rise, or if you live in an apartment complex, it's much more impractical than it is if you are in a single family home or a townhome or somewhere where you have access to charging at home.
Exactly, and that's the point. It's not that the money. A lot of the money isn't necessarily going to what is most practical, what makes sense, what cities actually have a demand for this, what city says they can actually build these electric vehicle charging stations, right? That's part of it. Once the money is out the door, you can't get it back.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago this Justice 40 program, and and so if I understand you correctly, what that means, so if the infrastructure bill, which you say is really a climate deal, it's what AOC wanted. It was a Green New Deal, and they're going to spend all this money. That means that 40% of the contracts can't be white people. Is that right? You can hire companies, but they can't be led by white people.
That's not necessarily true. Obviously, they give large preferences to minorities. It's who supposedly benefits from these projects, and that, like I said, that includes bridges, right? So if I need a new bridge in my town, costs a lot of money, but where the bridge isn't in a quote unquote disadvantaged community, I'm gonna have a really hard time getting that money for a new bridge or a new road or whatever.
Got it. All right. So so it's not about need. It's about skin color. I got that. I understand.
Exactly.
So does any of this, to your knowledge, run afoul of federal law? I mean, everywhere else in society, you're not allowed to do this. Actually, you're not allowed to prejudge people on the basis of their race in things like hiring. That's not allowed. In fact, you can get in massive trouble for that. But the federal government seems to be doing it without any consequence whatsoever.
Well, so they're trying to be clever about this, Vince. So there are documents that I received about this program from the White House, and the White House there's a FAQ document. And one of the questions that the White House answers is well, is this just giving money based out on race? And they say, oh no, of course not, of course not. However, all these other criteria just happen to disproportionately impact people of color. And on that point that I mentioned earlier, they're making sure that these nonprofits get that money to minority communities, often at the expense of white people or whoever. So they're trying to be very clever, too clever by half, by saying, oh, no, it's not about race, but all these things seem to only hurt, minorities or disproportionately impact minorities. And also we'll make sure that these NGOs that are financed by Soros get money and make sure that it goes to the right place. Yeah,
sure. But, we've had... this is sort of the history of the Democrat Party, but remember, in the wake of slavery, in order to prevent black people from voting, they would use pretextual means to try and stop it. They would do things like literacy tests, and they'd devise some other metric besides race itself to conceal that this was a racially targeted effort. And we're seeing it play out again in the 2024 format.
Yeah, and I think that's right. And I think one important point that I think everyone should be aware of, that this Justice 40 initiative, this is a template that the Democrats, the Biden administration, want to use for all spending going forward. I bet you didn't know, Vince, that affordable housing is actually climate spending, right? But it is, according to the Biden administration. So that means all new affordable housing, for example, has to have this Justice 40 component. And again, it talks bridges, electric grids, EV chargers, all these things that the Biden administration has been touting that's going to be great is all under this umbrella of Justice 40.
If the point was to help poor communities, as you began the conversation talking about, Joe, if that was the point, then I think there are going to be people out there that would agree with it. You could disagree over federal spending. We all do. In fact, I want to see a lot less federal spending on all levels. But if you wanted to give out some money to poor communities, that'd be like a fairly easy formula, I think, to do. Do you believe the Biden administration fears that there may be white people among the poor beneficiaries?
I think I won't necessarily go that far, but I think so much of this is essentially giving money and benefits to parts of the Democratic coalition. Because remember, Vince, if we're building EV stations in like Baltimore, places that don't necessarily have a really huge demand, or like bad neighborhoods, or that place in Alaska, that's also really a jobs program for those people there. And it doesn't really matter if they get built or not. It doesn't really matter if anyone uses them. The Biden administration can come and be like, hey, like, you want a union job? We're going to build a solar plant in downtown Detroit. You should join. Remember that in November.
Yes. Well, it also explains why when we look at the economic activity in the country, and the Biden administration keeps on claiming they're creating jobs, really the only sector that's actually growing is the government. That's a very dangerous and a precarious place to be as an economy when you're growing government jobs but not private sector ones. The whole thing will fall apart. Joe Simonson, thank you very much for digging into this and keeping them honest. I really appreciate it, sir.